one of the reasons I actually wrote the book is I didn't start off planning to write the book. I just started accumulating information, and I became more and more amazed with the story, and just kept keeping track of things. And at some point I was like, this has got to be shared, you know? But for me, the really interesting part, and part of the challenge, was sort of the beginning and the end. Because the middle part is fairly well known. You know, people know that Archibald Menzies, the botanist, and they know that he was out here with Vancouver. And we know a little bit about the monkey tree and some of those sort of stories. And that's fairly well documented. But what it was less well documented is all the stuff before that and all the stuff afterwards. You know, he really was a product of the Scottish Enlightenment. He used reason, he used his senses, he thought things through. I think he was fairly open-minded towards even indigenous religions. I mean, there's a great quote that I came across in one of his works. I can't remember it exactly, but it was something to the effect of, you know, that this was in Hawaii, where he had noticed the local indigenous people going through a religious ritual. And his comment in his journal was that they had as much devotion and sincerity towards their perception of deity as any European might on a bended knee in a cathedral someplace, or a high altar somewhere. And I thought, wow, this is, you know, and this is like 1790. You know, I was like, wow, that's pretty advanced thinking. You know, good for you. Well, that bust at VanDusen, I mean, VanDusen Gardens is fantastic. You know, everyone should go there. And when you do, in the Rose Garden, you'll see this bronze bust of Archibald Menzies. And I'd come across it years ago, I guess probably 6-7 years ago. And I just thought, well, who's this guy? Basically, because he's got the same last name as me. We're not related. But we come from the same Scottish clan. So I thought, you know, there's a bit of a connection there, but I thought, who is this guy, and why don't I know about him? And you know, that's sort of where the book actually began. But regarding the bust, one of the things that was interesting to me about it was it's by Jack Harmon, as an Order of British Columbia artist, sculptor. He did the Harry Jerome statue in Stanley Park. A lot of people know that. He's done a bunch of others. So he's a really good, acknowledged artist. It's a legitimate piece of artwork and sculpture. And it's the only one in the world. And I thought, really? It's the only one? I mean, there's got to be a bust of Archibald somewhere else, you know, Kew Gardens or Scotland or something. No, that's it. Just that one. And I thought, how bizarre that it's here. And also how wrong, you know. There should be one in his hometown, I would think. So with a friend of mine, Ted Menzies in Alberta, we got in touch with, it's a miracle story. Jack Harmon's son, Stephen, is also a sculptor and has a foundry. What are the odds, right? So we find Stephen, and we said, Stephen, you know, would kind of like to, if you've got copyright to this work of art, you know, could we make a copy of it, and could you make a copy of it? And he was like, yeah, yes and yes. So, I mean, don't want to go on forever on this, but, you know, Stephen got in his van, he drove over the Rockies, and this is all with the permission of all the authorities, by the way. And we took the bust off its pedestal, Stephen bubble wrapped it, put it back in his van, drove it back across the Rockies, recast it, made a copy, put the original back in bubble wrap over the Rockies, back to VanDusen, and now it's back. It's there, you can go see it. And then the copy we shipped to Scotland, and it's at Castle Menzies in the Archibald Menzies room. And so people that visit the castle can go and see that. And the connection to the castle is that he worked there as a boy. So he was born less than 5 kilometers from the castle, in a few feet away from these ancient standing stones, you know, sort of like Stonehenge, but not nearly as elaborate. But nevertheless, for a child, would have been kind of fascinating. But he grew up by these standing stones. He worked at the castle under the authority of the clan chief, and he worked in the gardens there. And that was where his career path began, because his clan chief, I think, identified that he had some talent and sent him to Edinburgh for proper training. And that's where everything else began. Anyway, so to bring it back to the bust, I thought, there really should be, we need to sort of complete the cycle, or make the connection there. And so now that's there, and there are these two busts. One, the original, the other, the copy, the only two in the world, and one in the Scottish Highlands and one on the west coast of British Columbia. What I find fascinating about it is this mix of science and botany, because they were very serious about collecting these plants and what the plants might reveal, but also the adventure. He did that initial work in Scotland and completed his training as a surgeon and got a job as a naval surgeon. So he joined the Navy, and then out of Portsmouth sailed down to the Caribbean. And there's a fascinating story there. It's occasionally, in most of the stuff that I read in my research, it gets, at most a paragraph, usually just a couple sentences, that he was at the Battle of Saints in the Caribbean. And then we move on to other things. And I'd never heard of the Battle of Saints, so I know a lot more about it now. But it was this massive battle in the Caribbean. Massive. It's like 30 British ships, 30 French ships. And he's the surgeon on there. So he was very busy. I'm going to skip through that, but he was in the Caribbean with the Navy as a naval surgeon, and then up to Halifax. And he was sort of stationed sort of between New York and Halifax for a year or so, and sailing up and down the coast there. But he did plant collecting along the way, and he would be sending plants and correspondence back to John Hope in Edinburgh, and John Hope would be sharing that with Joseph Banks in London. Banks had traveled around the world with Captain Cook. So he was very interested in this sort of thing, and Banks was collecting the plants and doing that on behalf of the king, who was also an avid gardener. And I found out had a secret nickname as Farmer George. When Archibald had finished his first trip to North America, he wrote to Joseph Banks with some help from John Hope and said, I've heard through the grapevine that there's this fur trading company that's going to be going to the Pacific, and I could be helpful. I could be the surgeon, and I could also collect some plants for you. And Banks thought, that's a great idea. So it was Joseph Banks that had him assigned to the King George's Sound Company, and he went on that first voyage, and that's when he first came to the Pacific Northwest, and was along here at Nootka Sound, and then back through China and around India and back home. And then just as soon as he got back there, or very shortly afterwards, there was the Vancouver mission that was to come back. So he got assigned to that, and then came around again and came here with Vancouver. So he had actually been here before George Vancouver. This was his second time here, was George Vancouver's first. But what a great guy to have on your ship if you're George Vancouver. I mean, you need a good botanist, you need a good surgeon, but you also need somebody that's been there before. And that's where he would have met Chief McKenna. Yeah, and there was thankfully even something in Archibald's notes describing the potlatch. Of course, it wasn't called a potlatch. He didn't. We know what that is. He was just describing what happened. And I was reading this, and I'm like, oh my God, that's a potlatch. He was at a potlatch. And they had just wonderful things to say about it, and it just seemed bizarre to me to think afterwards that was banned. Because the initial readings of it was, here's the chief, and he's giving away all his possessions, and he's demonstrating to everybody, his wealth and his generosity, and it's this giving thing. But just sort of to bridge back, we were talking earlier about the beginnings and Archibald's youth and where he came from. And this is the interesting thing about the Highland culture that he grew up in, is that they had this thing also, it was a new thing for me to read about, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly, but the duchas. So that sense of connection that people have to the land and to their things, but also the roles and responsibilities of a chief to their people. So not just as an authoritarian or as a judge, but also as somebody who provides for their people. So I think at some level Archibald would have understood what was going on with the Newfoundland North people at that time. And he may not have, and again, with the Highland, nowadays you can go and you can pull up a map and it says, this clan's here and this clan's there and in Scotland, right? And here's the borders. But in his time, there would have been no borders. There would have just sort of been an understanding that, well, this clan is kind of generally the ones that are here, and these are the ones that are, this clan is over here, and this is kind of the area where there's sort of maybe a little bit of overlap. And I think when he was along the West Coast, he would have also understood that, well, this is one tribe's area and this is another tribe's area, and you can't just sort of, there's no borderline there, but you could tell when you were leaving one area and arriving at another. And I think what a great resource that would have been for people like Vancouver, who was English and would have had a different upbringing and understanding of things like that.